What if a forgotten world once drifted between Earth and Mars? Not shattered in violence, but slowly erased by time itself. Somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of gravity, there may once have been another voice in the solar choir. A small planet, perhaps. A wandering sibling. A body that circled the sun for millions of years, watching oceans form, continents wander, and this long sleep of stone slowly awaken. And then, silence. Not a dramatic ending. Not a blazing catastrophe, just absence. Tonight's story drifts through that silence. Wherever the night has found its way to you, across a quiet room, through dim lamplight, or beneath the slow breathing of the dark, this journey unfolds gently, like dust settling through ancient water. Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. This is not a story of explosions or endings. It is a story of disappearance, of a planet that might have existed, and the quiet ways the universe forgets. Because the solar system is not a finished sculpture. It is a memory still eroding. Rings collapse, moons wander, orbits shift by fractions too small for human eyes to notice, yet large enough to reshape eternity. Between Earth and Mars lies a strange emptiness filled with fragments, millions of asteroids drifting like bones scattered across an ancient field. Fragments that may once have belonged to something whole, a world. But tonight the story will not rush toward answers. Time here moves differently, slowly, like glaciers thinking, like starlight crossing oceans of dark. Thus this is a meditation on a missing world, a planet that may have orbited between Earth and Mars long before the first forests breathed, or the first seas dreamed of life. A planet sometimes imagined by scientists, sometimes called Phaeton, sometimes nothing at all. Only a possibility, a shadow in orbital mathematics. But shadows can carry the memories, and sometimes the smallest absence leaves the deepest echo. So the night opens gently, like a fossil uncovered by wind. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of gravity, the story begins. The night begins with a question older than memory. What if a world once circled the sun between Earth and Mars, and slowly slipped out of existence, not shattered in fire, not erased in violence, but forgotten, wherever the quiet of this moment has found its way to you beneath dim light, of drifting thoughts, or the slow-breathing rhythm of evening, this story moves gently forward, like dust through ancient water. The solar system is often imagined as a finished thing, a clock whose gears were set long ago, turning perfectly through the darkness. But space remembers a different truth. Nothing here is finished. Orbits stretch, moons wander, worlds form, and sometimes unform. Between Earth and Mars there is a strange turbulence, a wide orbital valley where no planet rests. Only fragments drift there now, millions of asteroids gliding through the cold sunlight like scattered bones across an ancient field. Fragments of something, or fragments of nothing at all. Tonight's meditation drifts through that absence, through the quiet possibility that a world once moved there, slowly circling the sun, or watching the young planets settle into their long journeys, a planet sometimes imagined by astronomers, sometimes named Phaeton, sometimes spoken of only as a missing note in the music of gravity. But the universe rarely tells its stories in clear sentences. It whispers, through dust, through stone, through the long patience of time, and so the first chapter opens, not with certainty but with a feeling, the feeling of something that may have once been there. The Silent Orbit. Part 1. Long before forests covered Earth, before oceans learned the slow language of tides, before the moon settled into its quiet watch above the night, the solar system was still thinking, still deciding what it wanted to become. Clouds of dust circled the newborn sun like drifting smoke after a cosmic fire. Grains of metal, ice, and rock floated through the enormous rings, each particle slowly pulled into invisible conversations with gravity. Nothing hurried. Time itself seemed wider then. In those ancient eras, matter moved with a patience beyond imagination. Small fragments brushed against each other, clinging together through gentle collisions. Pebbles became stones. Stones gathered into mountains that floated through space. Mountains collided and softened into worlds. Planets were not built. They condensed, like dew forming on the quiet skin of morning. In the wide region between Earth and Mars, dust drifted slowly through sunlight that was younger and softer than the light known today. Particles moved in long arcs, drawn by the growing gravity of nearby bodies. Some fell inward toward the forming Earth, some wandered outward toward Mars, and some lingered in that quiet middle distance, waiting. Gravity is rarely loud. It does not strike or shout. It persuades, a slow pull, a patient invitation. Over thousands, millions, and tens of millions of years, drifting matter gathered itself into larger shapes. Invisible tides sculpted pathways through the dust. Within that quiet region, stones began to find each other. 1,000 small meetings, 10,000, millions. Collisions were gentle at first, pebbles brushing against pebbles, rock touching rock, each contact leaving behind a little more mass, a little more gravity, a slightly stronger voice in the endless conversation of motion. Eventually something larger began to form, a body, not yet a planet, but no longer dust. Perhaps it started as a cluster of stone no wider than a mountain range, and slowly rotating through the sunlight, gathering more fragments as it drifted through the crowded nursery of early space. Its gravity would have been faint, barely enough to hold loose rock together. But gravity grows quietly. Each new fragment added a whisper of weight. Each whisper made the next meeting easier. Over millions of years, the cluster thickened. Layers formed. The body became rounder, heavier, more certain of itself. The early solar system was filled with these growing seeds. Some would become planets, some would remain wandering stones, some would never finish becoming anything at all. And somewhere in that uncertain middle ground, a world may have been forming. A planet embryo, a body circling the Sun in a gentle orbit between two neighbours, Earth drifting slowly inward, Mars wandering just beyond. That this possible world would have moved through sunlight every few years, completing each orbit like a quiet breath in the life of the solar system. Its surface may have been rough with constant impacts, small asteroids striking its crust like falling rain across ancient stone. Heat would have gathered deep within it as radioactive elements quietly decayed, warmth rising slowly through its interior, melting pockets of rock. Volcanoes may have begun to appear, dark plains forming beneath the dim young sun. But the solar system was not peaceful then, it was crowded. Thousands of growing bodies wandered through intersecting paths, each one tugged by the gravity of the others. The architecture of the planetary system had not yet settled into the calm geometry known today. It was still rearranging itself, still negotiating. And beyond Mars, Tvärdsund, something enormous was forming. A giant whose gravity would soon breathe across the entire inner solar system. Jupiter. Its presence was slow but immense, like a distant ocean tide beginning to move beneath the quiet surface of space. And though that giant world remained far away, its gravity stretched outward through millions of kilometers of darkness, touching things, nudging them, whispering new directions into their orbits. If a planet had begun to grow between Earth and Mars, it would not have grown alone. It would have grown beneath those whispers, and gravity, patient as erosion, was only beginning its work. But the stones drifting through that silent region still carried their ancient purpose. They continued to gather, slowly, quietly. As though the solar system itself was trying to remember how to build a world, and somewhere within that drifting field of growing rock, the orbit of a forgotten planet may have begun to take shape. But what gravity creates, it does not always allow to remain. And far away, beyond the red deserts of Mars, the enormous breath of Jupiter continued to grow stronger. A distant force, still silent, still patient, still waiting. The young sun burned softly then. Not the steady star known today, but a restless furnace still learning its own balance. Streams of solar wind moved outward through the forming system, brushing past drifting stones and newborn planets like breath across dust. Light filled the space between worlds, yet silence remained deeper than any ocean. Within that silence, the slow labour of gravity continued. The growing body between Earth and Mars had begun to gather weight. Its surface would have been a landscape of unfinished thoughts, ridges of broken rock, wide plains of cooling lava, and craters blooming like dark flowers across the crust. No air yet softened its horizon, no water softened its scars, only stone. Stone remembering fire. Each passing million years added another layer of quiet change. Asteroids drifting through nearby space found themselves pulled inward by the body's increasing gravity. Impacts came often, though rarely with enough force to destroy the world forming beneath them. Instead, they fed it, stone adding itself to stone, fragments merging into wholeness. The surface would have shuddered often beneath these collisions, waves of molten rock rising through fractures in the crust. Volcanoes breathing slowly into the black sky, not dramatic eruptions, just heat escaping. The quiet exhale of a young planet cooling. Somewhere far below its surface, heavy metals would have begun their slow descent toward the center. Iron sinking through molten layers like droplets falling through deep water. This process, so invisible from the outside, was the beginning of a planet's hidden architecture, the birth of a core. Worlds grow from the inside as much as from the outside. Gravity sorts their ingredients carefully. Heavy elements descend inward. Lighter stone floats upward. Layers form, not by design but by patience. Core, mantle, crust. Even unfinished planets begin to arrange themselves this way, like memories settling into deeper and deeper places. Above this slow interior reshaping, the surface remained restless. And asteroids crossed the region frequently. Some struck at shallow angles, carving long scars through the crust before tumbling away again into solar orbit. Others arrived directly, sudden, brief, violent. Yet violence in the early solar system carried a strange purpose. Each collision delivered new minerals, new metals, new fragments that became part of the growing world. Creation and destruction were not separate processes. They were the same motion seen from different distances. The possible planet between Earth and Mars continued its quiet accumulation. Its orbit would have carried it through a gentle path around the Sun every few Earth years. Neither too close to the star's heat, nor too far into the cold outer darkness. A middle distance, balanced. Comfortable in the language of celestial mechanics. From afar, yet it might have appeared as little more than a bright stone drifting slowly through the sunlight. But gravity would have known better. Gravity always knows. Every world announces itself through the way it bends space around it. Even a small planet pulls subtly on neighbouring bodies, adjusting their paths by tiny amounts too small to see, but large enough to matter. And so the forming planet became part of a larger conversation. Earth felt its presence faintly. Mars felt it too, their orbits shifting by immeasurable fractions as the three worlds passed one another again and again across millions of years. A quiet choreography. The inner solar system learning its steps, but stability is a fragile thing in crowded systems. Too many bodies pulling on one another, and harmony begins to drift. Some orbits stretch slightly. Others tilt. Some bodies are nudged into new paths they never meant to follow. At first, these changes are gentle, almost invisible, like the slow bending of a tree beneath steady wind. Yet time magnifies small movements. A fraction of an orbit becomes a widening loop. A gentle tilt becomes a wandering path. Worlds that once passed each other peacefully begin crossing more dangerous distances, and far beyond this quiet region, something vast continued to grow. Jupiter. The giant planet gathered mass at a rate no other world could match. Gas flowed inward from the ancient disk surrounding the Sun, wrapping itself around the forming giant like an endless storm. With each passing million years, Jupiter's gravity deepened, expanded, reached farther into the solar system, like a tide spreading through darkness. And even from hundreds of millions of kilometers away, its presence began to tug on the smaller worlds inside. Not enough to tear them apart, not yet, but enough to disturb the delicate geometry of their orbits. The forming planet between Earth and Mars would have felt those distant whispers long before anything dramatic occurred. A slight stretching of its orbit, a subtle shift in timing, each circuit around the Sun arriving just a little differently than the one before. Perhaps nothing noticeable at first, just the quiet suggestion that the solar system was still rearranging itself. Gravity does not hurry. It leans, it nudges, and sometimes that is enough. The asteroid-filled region surrounding the growing planet also felt these distant gravitational breaths. Small rocks drifting nearby began slipping into new paths. Some wandered inward toward Earth, others drifted outward toward Mars. A few collided with the forming planet, adding their mass to its slow growth, but others missed. They passed close, then closer again, orbit after orbit, their paths weaving through space like threads pulled slightly out of alignment. The region between Earth and Mars slowly thickened with wandering fragments, some newly formed, others left over from earlier collisions. A field of drifting stone, not yet the asteroid belt known today, but something beginning to resemble it. The young planet continued to orbit through this growing debris field like a quiet shepherd, its gravity gathering what it could while letting other fragments slip past into the wider darkness. Time stretched forward, millions of years folding into tens of millions. Yet the surface cooled further. Volcanic plains hardened into dark basalt. Impact scars deepened. The world, if it truly existed, had begun the slow transformation from molten chaos into something more permanent, something almost still. Yet the solar system was not finished moving. Jupiter's gravity continued its silent expansion, like the tide of an unseen ocean slowly rising beneath the architecture of the planets. And gravity, once it begins to rearrange things, rarely stops halfway. Some forces do not arrive with noise, they arrive with patience, and the orbit of the quiet planet between Earth and Mars was slowly becoming part of a larger, more dangerous conversation. One that had been building across millions of years. One that the growing world could not yet understand. Because sometimes a planet can form perfectly and still not survive the gravity of its neighbours. Time continued its quiet descent through the early solar system. Millions of years folded into tens of millions, the way wind folds dunes across a patient desert. Nothing in space hurried. Even violence arrived slowly, stretched across centuries that no living mind would ever witness. The possible world between Earth and Mars continued its long-breathing orbit around the Sun. Each circuit through space traced the same invisible path, like a memory repeating itself across darkness. But memory in the universe is rarely permanent. It erodes, slowly. The surface of the young planet had begun to cool more deeply now. The ancient seas of magma that once rolled across its crust had hardened into vast plains of dark rock. The volcanoes still whispered occasionally through fractures in the stone, releasing heat stored deep in the planet's interior. A faint glow may have lingered across some regions at night. Not the light of fire, just warmth escaping, the slow sigh of a cooling world. Above that quiet surface, space remained restless. Fragments of rock wandered through nearby orbits like drifting leaves in an invisible current. Some were small enough to be no larger than mountains, others were only the size of houses or scattered stone. Each one carried its own silent path around the sun. Most of these fragments avoided the growing planet. Space, even when crowded, is vast. But sometimes paths crossed. When they did, impacts arrived without warning. A sudden flash, stone striking stone, crater walls rising like frozen waves around the wound. Then silence again. The planet endured these impacts the way ancient cliffs endure the sea. Scars accumulated, ridges formed, debris lifted briefly into space before settling again across the wounded surface. Every impact changed the world slightly, yet none was strong enough to erase it. Not yet. Because destruction in the universe rarely comes from a single moment. It grows, quietly. Somewhere far beyond the red plains of Mars, Jupiter had reached a new stage of its own becoming. The giant planet was no longer merely gathering gas and dust. Its gravity had begun shaping the solar system around it. Like a massive stone dropped into still water, Jupiter created ripples through the fabric of orbital motion. Invisible waves of influence. These waves did not strike directly, they resonated. And each planet orbiting the Sun carries a rhythm, a repeating cycle of movement defined by distance and speed. Most of the time these rhythms pass one another without consequence. But sometimes they align. When two orbital rhythms repeat in precise mathematical ratios, a resonance forms, a kind of gravitational echo. Each repetition adds a tiny push in the same direction, a whisper, repeated, again and again, over thousands, millions, tens of millions of years those whispers accumulate. The region between Earth and Mars had begun to feel these subtle echoes. Small asteroids wandering through the area found their orbits stretch slightly each time Jupiter completed its enormous circuit around the Sun. The effect was faint at first, barely noticeable, but repetition is powerful in a universe governed by patience, and each alignment had added a small disturbance to the paths of wandering stones. Some asteroids were nudged inward toward the orbit of Earth, others were pushed outward toward Mars. A few were lifted into tilted paths that crossed through the region at strange angles, like wandering thoughts slipping through an otherwise quiet mind. The young planet orbiting within this region could not escape those echoes entirely. Its own path around the Sun began to feel them too. At first, the changes were so small they would have been invisible to any observer. A slightly longer orbit, a slightly stretched ellipse. The planet moved a little farther from the Sun during part of its journey, and a little closer during another, like a breath deepening slowly. These changes alone would not destroy a world. Planets are resilient. Their gravity holds them together through far greater disturbances than this. But the echoes continued, year after year, orbit after orbit, each cycle reinforcing the last. The path of the planet began to drift further from its original shape. Its once gentle orbit became more elongated, pulling it deeper toward Mars at one end of its journey, while drawing it closer toward Earth at the other. This subtle stretching created new dangers. The planet now passed through regions of space crowded with wandering asteroids whose own paths had also been disturbed by Jupiter's distant gravity. More collisions began to occur, still not catastrophic, but more frequent, each impact lifting clouds of debris into orbit around the planet before those fragments slowly fell back to the surface or drifted away into independent solar paths. And a halo of rubble began forming around the world, not quite a ring, just scattered companions following similar orbits, stone remembering where it came from. Over time, these fragments multiplied. Each collision created more debris. Each fragment carried its own small gravitational influence, pulling gently on neighbouring stones. The quiet harmony of the region grew more complicated, more crowded, more unstable. Meanwhile, Jupiter's slow tidal breath continued. The giant planet did not notice the smaller worlds it disturbed. Its gravity simply existed, as vast and indifferent as an ocean tide moving across a distant shore. Yet those tides reshaped everything nearby. The stretched orbit of the young planet became more exaggerated over millions of years. At its closest approach to the Sun, it moved slightly faster than before, and at its farthest point, it lingered longer in the colder reaches of space till temperature differences across its surface deepened, stresses within its crust increased. Fractures opened in ancient rock. Volcanoes that had long slept began whispering again, releasing trapped heat through widening cracks. The planet was changing, not violently but persistently. Somewhere within the growing debris field surrounding it, a large asteroid wandered into a dangerous alignment with the planet's altered orbit. For thousands of years their paths crossed safely, passing each other in the dark without consequence. But orbital resonances rarely remain perfectly stable. Small changes accumulate, distances shrink, timing shifts. Eventually, two bodies that once avoided each other arrive at the same point in space at the same moment. So stone meets stone, the universe inhales, and something breaks. But even that moment, when it finally arrives, will not be the end. Because planets rarely disappear in a single event. They unravel, slowly, like memories dissolving into dust. And somewhere in the widening orbit between Earth and Mars, the quiet world continued its long journey around the Sun, unaware that gravity had already begun writing the first lines of its disappearance. Long before anything breaks, there is a period of quiet imbalance. The universe rarely leaps toward destruction. It leans toward it first, slowly shifting the delicate geometry that once held things steady. The young planet between Earth and Mars had entered such a leaning. Its orbit, once nearly circular, once calm and predictable, had stretched into something more uncertain. And a long oval path carved through the space, carrying the world deeper into the inner solar system before drifting outward again toward the colder edges near Mars. This stretching did not happen all at once. It unfolded across ages. Each orbit around the Sun brought the planet back to nearly the same place as before, but not quite. The timing shifted slightly, the path tilted by fractions too small to notice in a single year, yet large enough to matter when repeated across millions. Gravity continued whispering. Jupiter's distant resonance pulsed through the solar system like the slow beating of a heart too large to see. Each time the giant planet completed one of its long journeys around the Sun, its influence echoed through the asteroid-filled region between Mars and Earth. Most stones ignored the whisper, some did not. The debris surrounding the young planet had grown thicker over time. Fragments from ancient impacts drifted nearby, each one tracing its own path through sunlight. Some followed the planet loosely, lingering within its gravitational reach like scattered companions. Others wandered independently. But as orbital resonances deepened, those paths began to cross more often. Small collisions occurred in the darkness, stone striking stone, two fragments breaking into 10, 10 into 100. each new shard becoming another wandering voice in the growing conversation of gravity. The region between Earth and Mars slowly transformed into something more crowded, more restless, a quiet field of drifting debris. The young planet moved through this field like a traveller crossing a landscape filled with loose sand. Yet each passing orbit stirred the fragments around it. Some stones were captured briefly by its gravity before escaping again into solar orbit. Others struck the surface. Each impact reshaped the crust slightly. New craters opened across ancient plains. Dust rose briefly into the black sky before settling again. But one fragment drifting through this unstable region was larger than the rest, much larger. It may once have been part of another forming planet that never quite succeeded. A wandering remnant from the early days when countless bodies competed for survival within the young solar system. Its path around the Sun had been stable for millions of years. Quiet, predictable, yet resonance has a way of rewriting even ancient stability. Jupiter's distant gravity tugged gently at the fragment's orbit, stretching it just slightly each time the giant planet completed another revolution. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore, but time magnifies whispers. Over millions of years, the fragment's path slowly shifted inward. The elongated orbit of the young planet between Earth and Mars shifted outward at certain points in its cycle. Their paths began to overlap. At first, they passed safely, the distances between them still wide enough to avoid contact, but each encounter altered their motion slightly. Gravity exchanged tiny pieces of momentum between the two bodies, a subtle dance unfolding across centuries. With every pass, their trajectories grew more entangled, closer, more dangerous. The young planet did not notice. Planets cannot sense their own fate. They simply continue moving through the paths gravity provides. And on its surface, the long work of geology continued. Ancient lava plains cooled into basaltic deserts. Craters weathered slowly beneath constant micrometeorite impacts, their sharp edges softening into smoother circles. If mountains existed there, they stood in silent patience beneath a sky without clouds, without wind, without rain, only the slow accumulation of dust. Inside the planet, heat still moved gradually through its interior. The iron core settled deeper, releasing energy that kept the mantle warm and restless. Occasionally that warmth found escape through fractures in the crust. Volcanoes rose briefly, then quieted again. The world was alive in the geological sense, not thriving, but breathing slowly. Yet high above that quiet surface, the solar system's delicate geometry continued shifting, and each orbit brought the wandering fragment and the young planet slightly closer together, their paths crossing more directly, the gravitational exchange between them growing stronger. Eventually, the two bodies passed near enough that the smaller fragment felt the full tug of the planet's gravity. Its path bent slightly inward, curving like a drifting leaf caught by a gentle current. It did not strike the planet, not yet. Instead, it swung around it once, briefly captured within its gravitational influence before escaping again into a new solar orbit. But this near encounter changed everything. The fragment's path was now different, tilted, disturbed. Its next journey around the Sun would bring it back through the same region of space again, but with altered timing. The quiet mathematics of orbital mechanics had begun aligning their futures. Meanwhile, Jupiter's distant resonance continued adding its slow rhythm to the equation. Gravity layered upon gravity, echo upon echo. The solar system is full of such delicate instabilities, paths that appear safe for millions of years before gradually drifting into catastrophe. No sudden decision, just the patient unfolding of equations written long before. The wandering fragment completed another orbit around the Sun. So did the young planet. Their paths intersected again, closer this time. Gravity reached between them like invisible fingers, pulling, bending, adjusting their trajectories. Stone does not resist gravity, it obeys. Another orbit passed, then another. The distance between them shrank slowly with each encounter. Across the vast silence of space, two ancient bodies were drifting toward a meeting neither had intended. Yet even now, nothing had broken. Nothing had ended. The planet still circled the Sun through its stretched orbit. The wandering fragment still followed its altered path through the growing field of asteroids. But the quiet balance of the region had already begun to unravel, because sometimes a world's fate is not sealed by violence, but by timing. A single moment when two paths finally arrive at the same place in the dark. and somewhere between Earth and Mars, that moment was approaching, slowly, inevitably, like dust settling toward the floor of time. There is a moment in every long process when the slow leaning of time finally becomes motion. Not sudden, not violent, just unavoidable. Here, for millions of years, the young planet had circled the sun through its widening path, drifting inward and outward like a quiet tide. The wandering fragment, ancient, heavy, patient, continued tracing its altered orbit through the same silent region. Again and again their paths crossed. At first with generous distance between them, then with less. Each pass was like two thoughts drifting closer within the same quiet mind. Gravity adjusted them gently every time they met, exchanging faint pulls that reshaped their future paths. Neither body understood this slow conversation. They simply obeyed. Stone always obeys gravity. The fragment approached once more after another long journey around the sun. It had drifted far beyond Mars during part of its orbit before falling inward again toward the warmer light of the inner solar system. The young planet had done the opposite, sweeping outward from near Earth's path before curving slowly back toward the sun. Their rhythms had begun aligning, not perfectly, but closely enough. Space remained immense around them, yet the invisible geometry of their motion had grown delicate. Each new orbit narrowed the gap slightly more. Another meeting came, closer. The fragment passed within the outer reach of the planet's gravitational field again. Its path bent more sharply this time, pulled inward like a drifting boat caught by the edge of a quiet whirlpool. It did not strike. Instead, it curved around the planet in a slow arc, passing across the dark sky above its silent surface. For a brief time, the fragment became a temporary moon. If anyone had stood upon that young world during those distant ages, and a second stone might have crossed the sky for a few hours or days, an enormous dark shape gliding soon beneath through the blackness. Then gravity released it again. The fragment escaped, but not unchanged. Its orbit had been altered once more, stretched into a new ellipse that would return it through the same dangerous crossing point again in the future. These repeated near encounters slowly tightened the connection between the two bodies. Their motions became linked, each orbit influencing the next like echoes within a canyon. Meanwhile, the debris field surrounding the planet continued thickening. Each small collision between asteroids added new fragments to the region. Some were captured briefly by the planet's gravity, others drifted into distant orbits around the sun. The quiet world moved through this shifting cloud like a stone through fog. Impacts became more common now, still not catastrophic, but persistent. Every few centuries, perhaps every few decades, another fragment struck the surface. Dust rose briefly into the vacuum before settling again across ancient plains. The crust bore these scars patiently. Planetary surfaces are archives. They remember every collision. Each crater preserved the moment when stone met stone beneath the silent sky. But the largest wandering fragment continued its long approach. Orbit after orbit, encounter after encounter. Gravity adjusted its path slightly more each time, and Jupiter's distant resonance still whispered through the entire region, subtly stretching and nudging the trajectories of every body caught within its influence. These layered forces slowly sharpened the alignment. The next meeting would not be another distant pass. Their paths had become too intertwined. The young planet completed another orbit around the sun. Its elongated path carried it inward through the brighter light near Earth's orbit before drifting outward again toward Mars. The fragment approached from the opposite direction, falling inward from the colder outer darkness. Two ancient bodies, both shaped by millions of years of slow motion, both carrying the quiet history of the solar system within their stone. They arrived at the same place in space, at the same time. Gravity reached between them instantly, not a whisper now, a grasp. The fragment was pulled sharply toward the planet's gravity well. Its path curved inward with sudden certainty, but no longer able to escape the larger body's influence. For a moment the two worlds seemed to hesitate within the dark. Their motions slowed relative to each other as gravity drew them together. Then the distance vanished. The collision, when it finally came, was not secret. Stone does not meet stone gently at such speeds. The fragment struck the planet with the energy of unimaginable force, millions of years of orbital motion released in a single instant. The crust shattered beneath the impact. Shockwaves raced through the planet's interior like earthquakes magnified beyond measure. Rock vaporized instantly at the point of contact, erupting outward, in a plume of molten debris that rose far above the wounded surface. For a brief moment, the planet glowed, not with the calm warmth of ancient volcanoes, but with the fierce brightness of freshly broken stone. The impact crater would have been enormous, hundreds of kilometers across, its walls collapsing inward as the molten crust struggled to settle. Fragments from both bodies were thrown outward into space. Some fell back onto the surface in fiery arcs. Others escaped the planet's gravity entirely, drifting away into solar orbit as new asteroids. Yet even this terrible collision did not destroy the world completely. Planets are resilient. They absorb violence. The wounded planet remained mostly intact, though its surface had been violently reshaped. The impact scar glowed for centuries as molten rock slowly cooled within the enormous crater. Debris continued raining down across the surface for generations afterward. But something deeper had changed. The collision had altered the planet's motion. The delicate balance of its orbit, already stretched and unstable, had been disrupted further by the transfer of momentum from the incoming fragment. Its path around the Sun shifted again, more elongated now, more unpredictable. Each orbit would carry it into new regions of the growing asteroid field. The quiet harmony of its movement had been broken, and gravity, once disturbed, rarely restores what it once held. The wounded world continued its journey through space, still whole, still circling the Sun, but no longer stable. The debris created by the impact joined the widening field of drifting stone between Earth and Mars. Hundreds of fragments followed similar paths around the Sun, spreading slowly through the region like dust after a long-faded explosion. And the solar system did not notice. Stars do not pause for broken worlds. Planets continued their quiet orbits. Jupiter's distant gravity continued breathing across the darkness, and the injured planet, carrying the scar of that ancient collision, moved forward into a future where stability had already begun to slip away. Because sometimes the first fracture does not end a world. It only begins the long process of unmaking it, like a crack in ancient ice, barely visible at first, but slowly widening, across the silent patience of time. After the impact, the solar system returned to silence. Not because nothing had happened, but because silence is the universe's natural state. The wounded planet continued its slow journey around the Sun, carrying the memory of the collision like a scar carved deep into ancient stone. The crater left by the wandering fragment remained molten for centuries, glowing faintly beneath the black sky while rivers of liquid rock cooled into dark glass across its floor. Eventually the heat faded, the surface hardened, and the scar became just another shape in the planet's growing archive of craters. From far away the world might still have looked unchanged. A small planet drifting calmly between Earth and Mars, tracing its long orbit through sunlight as it had for millions of years. But inside its motion, something had shifted. The collision had altered the planet's momentum slightly, enough to disturb the fragile balance that had once guided its path. The elongated orbit stretched further now, pulling the world deeper toward the Sun during the part of its journey and carrying it farther outward during another. And each circuit around the Sun became a little less predictable. Gravity continued its quiet negotiations with the planet's new trajectory. Jupiter's distant presence still resonated through the region like a low vibration beneath the surface of space. Those ancient echoes, repeating across millions of years, began pulling more strongly on the wounded world's stretched orbit. The once gentle oval of its path slowly grew sharper, more eccentric, more vulnerable. A planet's orbit is not just a line drawn through space. It is a conversation between many forces. The Sun holds the central gravity, guiding all worlds through their primary motion. But every other body in the system contributes its own subtle influence. Tiny adjustments accumulating over immense periods of time. Earth whispered its gravity as the wounded planet passed nearby. And Mars whispered too, but Jupiter's voice remained the deepest. The wounded world began entering regions of space where these gravitational echoes overlapped more frequently. The asteroid debris left behind by the ancient collision drifted nearby, spreading slowly along similar orbits. Some fragments followed the planet loosely, lingering near its path like scattered companions. Others wandered freely through the region, crossing its orbit unpredictably. The once solitary planet had become surrounded by a cloud of its own history. Each new orbit through this debris field brought more collisions. Small at first, pebbles striking the surface like silent rain, then larger stones, A fragment the size of a mountain might strike every few thousand years, opening fresh wounds across the crust and sending new plumes of rock into space. And the surface grew restless again. Ancient plains shattered beneath repeated impacts. Old craters overlapped with new ones. Dust rose in thin clouds before settling slowly across the wounded terrain. The planet endured. Worlds can survive remarkable violence. But each collision added new debris to the growing swarm surrounding the planet's orbit. The region between Earth and Mars was becoming something different now. Not the calm birthplace of a forming world, but a widening field of drifting stone, a slow unmaking. The gravitational disturbances caused by Jupiter continued shaping this debris. Some fragments were flung outward toward the giant planet's distant realm. Others were pushed inward toward the inner solar system, occasionally crossing Earth's orbit like wandering messengers from an ancient catastrophe. Many remained. They drifted along the same unstable pathways, forming the earliest hints of what would one day become the asteroid belt. Meanwhile, the wounded planet continued its long circuits around the Sun, but its orbit was changing faster now. Each gravitational interaction with passing fragments altered its motion slightly. Each distant resonance from Jupiter stretched the orbit further from its original shape. The path became unstable. At certain points during its orbit, the planet now crossed regions crowded with debris whose paths intersected its own. Collisions became more frequent, more energetic. Some impacts were large enough to tear enormous chunks from the planet's crust, launching them into space where they joined the growing population of wandering asteroids. The world was shedding itself piece by piece. Still it survived. But survival in space is rarely permanent. Eventually another large fragment, perhaps one born from the earlier collision, perhaps one that had drifted through the region for millions of years, entered the same dangerous alignment that had once doomed the first wandering body. Gravity guided its path slowly inward. The planet approached along its stretched orbit. Once again, two ancient stones found themselves moving toward the same point in space. But this time the wounded world was weaker. Its crust fractured, its orbit unstable, its surroundings filled with the debris of its own slow disintegration. The second collision came after millions more years of quiet instability. Another tremendous impact, another shockwave racing through the planet's interior. This time the damage ran deeper. The crust cracked along ancient fractures left by earlier impacts. Entire regions of the surface collapsed inward as molten rock surged upward through broken layers of stone. Debris blasted outward with greater force than before. Thousands of fragments escaped the planet's gravity entirely. They spread into solar orbit, drifting away slowly across the region between Earth and Mars. The wounded world remained, but barely. Its structure had weakened. Its orbit stretched further still. Each passing million years brought more collisions, more fragments escaping into space. The once coherent planet slowly began to unravel, not in a single catastrophic explosion, but through erosion. Stone breaking away, gravity scattering the pieces. The solar system does not always destroy worlds violently. Sometimes it simply refuses to hold them together. Over immense spans of time, the wounded planet lost more and more of its mass. Larger fragments drifted away to become independent asteroids. Smaller pieces crumbled into dust that spread invisibly through the region. What remained grew smaller, less spherical, more fractured. Eventually, the gravity that once held the planet together weakened enough that even modest impacts could shatter large portions of its surface. The world had become fragile, a broken body drifting through an unstable orbit. And gravity, patient as always, continued its slow work. Because the universe does not rush endings, it lets them unfold, quietly, like stone turning slowly into dust beneath the endless breathing of time. And in the long silence between Earth and Mars, a planet that may once have existed was slowly becoming something else. Fragments, drifting, remembering the shape they once shared. The unmaking of a world does not happen in a moment. It happens in layers, like cliffs wearing down beneath a quiet sea, like mountains softening, grain by grain beneath the slow patience of wind. For millions of years more, the wounded planet continued its fragile orbit between Earth and Mars. Yet the word planet was beginning to lose its meaning. What once had been a round body with a clear gravity, a core settling quietly beneath its crust, had become something fractured, incomplete. Its surface was no longer whole. Vast regions had collapsed where earlier collisions had weakened the crust. New impacts struck more frequently now, each one tearing loose fragments that drifted away into independent paths around the sun. The world was shedding its skin, stone escaping into space. Each fragment carried the memory of the planet's gravity within its motion. At first, many pieces remained loosely clustered, following similar orbits like scattered beads drifting along the same invisible thread. But gravity rarely allows fragments to remain together forever. Some drifted outward, nudged gently by the distant pull of Jupiter. Others wandered inward toward the inner solar system, occasionally crossing the path of Earth long before life had risen from its oceans. Each fragment became a small traveller, a wandering piece of a forgotten body. Over immense spans of time, the cluster widened. What had once been a broken planet slowly stretched into a long stream of drifting stone scattered across the orbital valley between Earth and Mars. Not chaos, but dispersion. The pieces moved through space with quiet dignity, each one tracing the path gravity offered. Meanwhile, the central remnant of the planet, what little remained of its original mass, continued to fracture under the strain of repeated collisions. The once stable gravity that held its interior together weakened as mass escaped into space. Without that strength, the remaining structure grew fragile. Mountains collapsed, crustal plates cracked apart. Molten rock that had once been trapped deep within the mantle seeped outward through enormous fractures, cooling into jagged plains that would soon shatter again beneath the next impact. Earth, the world, was no longer a planet in the traditional sense. It was becoming a field, a gathering of fragments, a memory slowly scattering across the sun's light. Some pieces were large enough to hold their own small gravity. These became the larger asteroids that still wander through the belt today. Ceres, Vesta, Pallas, and many others. Each one a survivor of a long erosion. Others were smaller. Broken mountains, shattered hills, dust. They drifted through the same region like forgotten words carried by an ancient wind. Time continued passing. Hundreds of millions of years. The orbits of the remaining fragments slowly stabilized under the combined influence of the Sun and Jupiter. Regions of the belt where resonances were strongest cleared themselves of debris as stones were flung outward or inward into new solar paths. What remained formed a loose ring of asteroids, a graveyard of unfinished worlds. The largest fragments cooled slowly through the ages. Their surfaces hardened into silent landscapes of cratered plains and fractured ridges. Some preserved ancient volcanic features from the time when the original planet had still possessed a warm interior. Others bore the marks of countless smaller collisions accumulated across eons. Each fragment became a fossil, a page torn from the solar system's earliest history. And far away, the planets that had once been neighbours to the vanished world continued their own quiet journeys. Earth circled the Sun. Mars circled the Sun. Neither remembered the body that may once have shared the space between them. Planets do not carry memory the way living minds do. They remember only through gravity. And gravity had already moved on, but the fragments remained. Billions of years later, they still drift through that same region of space, quietly orbiting the Sun in a wide band between Mars and Jupiter. Seen from afar, the asteroid belt appears sparse, empty, yet every stone within it carries a story older than mountains, older than oceans, older even than the continents themselves. Some scientists believe these fragments were never a planet at all, only the leftover building blocks that Jupiter's gravity prevented from ever forming a world. Others still wonder, because some asteroids carry signs of differentiation, heavy metals settled inward, lighter rock floating above, just as happens inside a forming planet. Hints, whispers, evidence that at least some of these stones once belonged to something larger, something whole. Whole? The truth may never be known completely. Time erodes evidence the same way it erodes mountains. But the silence between Earth and Mars remains curious, a wide orbital valley where a planet might have lived, a space where gravity once gathered matter, then slowly scattered it again across the quiet architecture of the solar system. And if that world truly existed, if it once circled the Sun with its own quiet gravity, it did not vanish in fire or sudden catastrophe, it faded, slowly, across millions of years, stone turning into fragments, fragments turning into dust. A planet dissolving into memory. But even memory in the universe never disappears completely, because every asteroid still circling between Mars and Jupiter carries a small piece of the past within its stone, and sometimes, very rarely, one of those fragments falls toward Earth, crossing the dark, entering the sky, a brief streak of light, before becoming silent again. Ashes that still saw orbit across the long, quiet centuries that followed the unmaking of that possible world. The fragments continued drifting. Stone does not hurry. Each piece carried its own slow orbit around the sun, guided by gravity the way leaves are guided by a river's current. Some fragments remained near the path where the old planet may have once circled. Others wandered outward or inward, their motion stretched and softened by Jupiter's distant breath. Yet none truly left the solar system. Matter rarely disappears. It simply rearranges itself into quieter forms. The asteroid belt, as it would one day be called, slowly settled into its wide, scattered ring. And millions of fragments drifted there, some no larger than pebbles, others the size of small worlds. From far away the belt looked empty, a thin halo of dust between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. But emptiness in space is often only distance. Within that quiet region, each asteroid continued carrying the ancient chemistry of the early solar system. Metals that had once sunk toward the heart of a forming planet remained locked inside some stones. Other fragments preserved minerals shaped by heat deep within a world that may have briefly existed before dissolving into debris. Time wrapped itself around them. Billions of years passed. The sun aged slowly, growing steadier and brighter as the solar system cooled into the calmer structure known today. Earth's oceans formed, continents rose and broke apart. So life stirred within ancient seas and slowly learned the language of survival. Yet above all those unfolding stories, the asteroid belt remained. Silent, patient, a drifting archive of broken beginnings. Each asteroid spun slowly in the dark, its surface marked by countless impacts accumulated across unimaginable spans of time. Craters layered upon craters, scars upon scars like rings inside the trunk of an ancient tree. But stone keeps secrets. Inside many meteorites that eventually fall to Earth, tiny fragments chipped from those ancient asteroids, scientists have discovered structures that speak of deeper origins, metallic cores, basaltic crusts, minerals that could only have formed under the pressure and heat found within a growing planetary body. Such stones whisper strange possibilities. They suggest that at least some fragments in the asteroid belt were once part of larger bodies, protoplanets that began forming during the solar system's earliest ages before gravity and collision scattered them apart. Perhaps the lost world between Earth and Mars was one of those bodies. Or perhaps many such worlds briefly existed there, growing slowly before dissolving into the drifting field of stone seen today. The universe rarely preserves its first drafts. Creation is often messy. Dust gathers into worlds, worlds fracture into dust again, and between those two states lies only time. Occasionally one of those ancient fragments begins a journey toward Earth. Gravitational nudges from Jupiter or Mars alter its orbit slightly, pushing it into a path that slowly crosses the inner solar system. The fragment drifts for the millions of years, orbit after orbit, sunlight warming one side of its surface while the other remains frozen in shadow. Microscopic impacts pepper its exterior, each collision adding another tiny scar to its long memory. Eventually its orbit intersects with Earth's path. Gravity takes hold, the fragment begins falling inward. Its speed increases quietly as it descends through the dark. Earth grows larger beneath it, blue oceans turning slowly beneath white clouds, continents drifting across the curved horizon. The asteroid enters the atmosphere. For the first time in billions of years, it touches air. Friction ignites the surface instantly. The stone begins glowing, shedding molten droplets that streak behind it like brief tears of fire across the sky. From the ground, it appears as a falling star, a silent line of light lasting only seconds. But inside that glowing fragment lies material older than Earth's mountains, older than its oceans, older even than the moon. Some of those meteorites carry isotopes, tiny atomic fingerprints that formed during the earliest days of the solar system, when the sun itself was still surrounded by swirling clouds of dust. Others carry the signs of differentiation, heavy metals gathered inward, lighter rock layered above, evidence of interior structure, evidence that the stone once belonged to something larger than itself, perhaps part of a planetary crust, perhaps part of a core, perhaps a fragment of a world that no longer exists. When such meteorites land quietly upon Earth's surface, settling into deserts, forests, or frozen polar ice, they become messages from a time long before memory. As scientists study them carefully, not to solve a mystery completely, but to listen, because stone speaks slowly, through isotopes, through mineral grains, through the quiet geometry of atoms that remember the heat and pressure of ancient worlds. Some fragments reveal that water once touched their surfaces. Others carry traces of volcanic activity from a time when molten rock flowed across landscapes that have long since vanished. These whispers do not tell a full story, but they suggest something once existed between the orbits of Earth and Mars that was more than dust alone. Something that began forming like a planet, something that cooled, something that fractured, and something whose remains still wander the solar system today. The asteroid belt may be less like a graveyard and more like an unfinished sentence. And a thought the solar system began, then slowly abandoned. Yet the fragments continue their quiet motion. Stone remembering gravity, dust remembering the shape of a lost world. And every so often, a piece of that ancient memory falls through Earth's sky, glowing briefly as it returns to the warmth of the inner solar system. A fragment of silence, a shard of forgotten time. Stone remembers things that light forgets. Starlight travels endlessly forward, leaving the past behind with every passing second. But stone carries time within itself. Layer by layer, atom by atom, it preserves the quiet memory of pressures, temperatures, and ancient collisions long after the events themselves have faded into silence. The asteroids drifting between Mars and Jupiter are filled with such memories. Each one turns slowly through the cold sunlight, and its surface absorbing and releasing heat in patient rhythms that repeat across billions of years. Some spin lazily, taking days to complete a single rotation. Others tumble irregularly, fractured shapes turning through space without any clear sense of up or down. Yet inside many of them lies a deeper stillness, a stillness older than planets. Minerals within these fragments formed when the solar system was young enough that its dust still remembered the warmth of creation. Iron condensed from ancient nebular clouds, nickel settled beside it. Silicates crystallized as molten rock cooled inside bodies that briefly held enough gravity to organize their interiors. These structures remain frozen within the stone, small, precise, silent. When meteorites reach Earth, scientists sometimes slice them open and polish their surfaces until the hidden patterns appear. Under careful light, metallic lines spread across the cut stone like frost growing across glass. These patterns are called Widmanstätten structures. They form only when molten metal cools incredibly slowly, sometimes over millions of years, inside a body large enough to hold heat deep within its core. A small asteroid could not create such patterns alone. The cooling would happen too quickly. But inside a larger world, inside a planet forming slowly beneath the quiet pressure of its own gravity, heat lingers longer. Metal settles inward toward the center. Crystals grow gradually as the temperature falls across immense spans of time. The patterns inside those meteorites whisper of interiors that once existed, of cores, of mantles, of crusts. Evidence that some fragments within the asteroid belt were once part of bodies far larger than themselves, perhaps even part of a world, not necessarily a single lost planet. The early solar system was filled with many such proto-worlds, planetary embryos slowly gathering mass from the surrounding disk of dust and stone. Some would merge together to form the planets known today. Others would collide, break apart, scatter. The region between Earth and Mars may have once been crowded with these forming bodies, worlds beginning to shape themselves, their gravity pulling nearby fragments inward as they slowly grew. But Jupiter's distant presence complicated everything. Its enormous gravity stirred the region repeatedly, disturbing the delicate orbits of those young worlds. Instead of merging into a single planet, many of them collided and fractured it, leaving behind the debris field that remains today. If a world did briefly form there, if a planet once circled quietly in that orbital valley, its existence may have been temporary. A moment of geological coherence within a system still deciding its final architecture. The fragments drifting there today may be the last surviving sentences from that early chapter, stone that remembers what the solar system once attempted. Among the largest asteroids still wandering that ancient field is Ceres. Unlike many smaller fragments, Ceres is nearly spherical. Its gravity is strong enough to pull its material inward, smoothing its shape into a round body more like a small planet than a typical asteroid. Beneath its surface lies a mixture of rock and ice. Some evidence suggests that long ago, the liquid water may have moved slowly beneath its crust. a quiet ocean buried beneath frozen stone. Other large asteroids tell different stories. Vesta carries the scars of enormous impacts that nearly tore it apart. Its surface preserves ancient lava flows, evidence that its interior once melted and separated into layers, much like a forming planet. These bodies are survivors, remnants of something larger that never quite finished becoming whole. They drift through the asteroid belt like bones left behind after the erosion of time. Each orbit around the Sun is a repetition of ancient motion. 4.5 billion years have passed since those early days of planetary formation. Continents have risen and fallen on Earth countless times. Oceans have advanced and retreated. Entire species have appeared and vanished like brief whispers in the story of life. Yet the asteroids continue their slow circuits almost unchanged. They spin through sunlight, through darkness, through the quiet tides of gravity. Some remain stable for billions of years. Others wander gradually into new orbits. Occasionally a fragment drifts close enough to Jupiter's powerful resonance that its path becomes unstable. Gravity stretches the orbit, pushing the stone inward toward the Sun or outward toward the distant cold beyond Mars. Those wandering fragments sometimes cross the inner solar system. A few arrive near Earth. Their descent through the atmosphere transforms ancient stone into sudden light. The surface melts and burns as the fragment falls, then shedding its outer layers in glowing streaks that vanish quickly into darkness. Yet inside, the core of the meteorite often survives. When such stones land upon Earth, they bring with them small pieces of a time long before the planet itself had cooled, a time when the solar system was still forming, still colliding, still deciding which worlds would remain. Scientists hold these fragments carefully in laboratories today, studying their composition like archaeologists examining artifacts from a civilization older than memory. Every isotope, every crystal, every metallic pattern inside the stone becomes a clue, not proof, but suggestion. Hints that the quiet region between Earth and Mars was once more crowded than it appears now. Hints that gravity once gathered matter there into something larger. And hints that the solar system may have briefly held another world whose name, if it ever had one, has long since been carried away by time. And yet the fragments remain. They orbit patiently beneath the sunlight. They drift through the darkness. They wait. Because even after billions of years, the ashes of a vanished world may still be circling the Sun. The long silence between worlds. Between the orbits of planets lies a peculiar quiet, not emptiness exactly, more like a pause in the long sentence of gravity. Earth circles the Sun with steady patience, its blue surface turning slowly beneath clouds and oceans. Mars drifts farther out, its deserts glowing faintly red beneath a colder sky. And between them stretches a wide region where no planet rests. Just distance, just fragments, just the soft drifting of ancient stone. From far away the solar system appears orderly, its planets spaced along elegant pathways carved by gravity's invisible hand. Yet that empty region between Earth and Mars interrupts the pattern slightly, like a missing word in a familiar phrase. The gap is not enormous by cosmic standards, but it is curious. For in the earliest days of the solar system, when dust first gathered itself into worlds, that space held plenty of material. Pebbles, rocks, and mountain-sized bodies drifted there in abundance, each one circling the young sun as gravity slowly invited them into larger gatherings. The same process that built Earth and Mars was happening there too. Matter collecting, stone touching stone, fragments finding each other through the quiet pull of the mass. Yet today no planet occupies that orbit, and only a scattered belt of asteroids remains beyond Mars, and an unusually wide silence lingers closer to Earth. Silence can be meaningful in the universe. Astronomers sometimes learn more from what is absent than from what is present. A missing object can reshape the paths of everything around it, leaving faint disturbances in motion that linger long after the body itself has vanished. But in this case the silence is almost perfect. Earth's orbit is stable. Mars follows its long elliptical path with quiet consistency. The Sun holds both worlds securely within its gravity. Whatever may have happened between them left little trace in the modern architecture of the solar system. Time has a way of smoothing away the sharp edges of ancient events. Over billions of years, gravity reshapes orbits, scattering fragments into distant paths or sweeping them into planets and stars. Dust settles, motion stabilizes, the solar system forgets, Yet some traces remain. The asteroid belt, drifting farther outward between Mars and Jupiter, still carries the scattered memory of that early era. Millions of fragments move there in patient arcs around the Sun, each one following a path shaped by countless ancient interactions. The belt is not dense. Most asteroids are separated by vast distances. A spacecraft travelling through the region would rarely come near one. Yet together they form a quiet structure, like a loose necklace of stone surrounding the Sun. Some scientists believe this belt contains the leftover building blocks of a planet that never formed. Jupiter's immense gravity, they suggest, stirred the region too strongly during the solar system's youth, preventing the smaller fragments from merging into a single stable world. Others wonder whether a planet did form there briefly, a body that gathered mass, cooled, perhaps even differentiated into layers of metal and rock before later collisions or gravitational disturbances slowly dismantled it. The truth may lie somewhere between those possibilities. Perhaps several proto-worlds grew there, each beginning the slow journey toward planetary identity before collisions scattered them apart. Or perhaps one world grew larger than the rest, large enough to shape its surroundings, large enough to begin behaving like a planet. And then something changed. But the universe does not record its history in clear narratives. Instead, it leaves fossils, fragments. Hints scattered through the stone and motion. Silence fills the gaps. The region between Earth and Mars remains one of those quiet places where questions linger. Not dramatic questions, just gentle ones. Why does no planet circle there today? Why does that wide orbital valley remain mostly empty? What stories once unfolded in that quiet stretch of space long before Earth's oceans formed and life began its slow awakening? Gravity does not answer. It only continues its work. The planets move along their ancient paths. Mars passes through the darkness. Earth follows its calm orbit closer to the Sun, and between them the silence persists. Yet silence in the universe is rarely truly empty. Dust drifts through that region still. Small fragments wander across the gap, relics from ancient collisions that have slowly spread outward from the asteroid belt. Each tiny particle carries the faint chemical memory of the early solar system. Atoms forged in stellar furnaces long before the Sun was born. Minerals that condensed from the cooling disk of gas and dust that once surrounded the young star. Every grain of cosmic dust is older than mountains, older than oceans, older even than the continents beneath Earth's seas. Together they drift through the quiet space between worlds, tracing invisible paths shaped by gravity's endless patience. They are reminders that even emptiness has a history, a memory of things that once existed, things that gathered briefly into form before dissolving again into fragments. And perhaps long ago, one of those forms was a planet that circled quietly between Earth and Mars, a world that lived only briefly within the long life of the solar system, a world that gravity allowed to form and time allowed to fade. But time does not erase everything. Some traces remain buried within the drifting stones of the asteroid belt, and in those fragments, ancient clues still wait beneath the slow turning of sunlight. Silence in space is not truly empty. It carries motion too slow to notice. Between the orbit of Earth and the wandering path of Mars, sunlight drifts through a vast corridor where gravity holds almost nothing together. Yet even there, the darkness is never still. Dust moves quietly, tracing arcs around the Sun like breath moving through an ancient cathedral. The particles are small, some no larger than grains of sand, and others finer still like ash scattered across invisible wind. Each one circles the Sun patiently, repeating its long path through the same silent valley, year after year, century after century, age after age. Most of these particles were born from collisions, tiny fragments chipped away from asteroids far beyond Mars. When two stones meet in that distant belt, the impact often releases clouds of microscopic debris that drift outward slowly, spreading across the inner solar system. Over millions of years, those grains wander. Some spiral inward toward the Sun, some fall toward Earth, some pass quietly through the space between planets without ever touching anything again. Yet within their motion lies a faint memory. Because dust is not merely debris, it is the residue of structure. Every grain once belonged to something larger. And a rock, a mountain, perhaps even a fragment of a world that no longer exists. Light touches those particles gently as they travel through the quiet region between Earth and Mars. Sunlight warms their surfaces for a moment before they rotate into darkness again. Their temperatures rise and fall slowly, repeating the same small rhythm across billions of orbits. The dust remembers the sun, but it also remembers its origin. Within each grain are atoms arranged in patterns shaped long ago by heat and pressure. Some carry traces of molten interiors from bodies that once grew large enough to warm themselves from within. Others contain minerals that formed in the cold outskirts of the solar nebula, before drifting inward during the chaotic youth of the solar system. Each particle carries a history older than the Earth itself. Yet those histories remain quiet. No voice announces them. Only patient observation reveals their story. Astronomers studying the distribution of dust within the inner solar system have noticed something subtle about this region between Earth and Mars. Compared with other areas, it holds slightly less lingering debris than might be expected from the early era of planetary formation. The valley appears unusually clean, not empty, but smoothed, as though gravity had swept through it long ago, removing much of the scattered material that once lingered there. Such clearing can happen when a large body occupies an orbit for a long time. A planet tends to gather nearby fragments through gravity, either absorbing them into its surface or scattering them into distant paths over millions of years, till the region surrounding that planet becomes quieter, cleaner, stable. But if the planet later disappears, through collisions or gravitational disruption, the cleared valley may remain for a long time afterward, a faint architectural trace, like the empty foundation of a building long removed. Some astronomers have quietly wondered whether that is what the space between Earth and Mars represents. The lingering absence of something that once moved there. Not proof, only suggestion. Gravity rarely leaves clear fingerprints, but sometimes its past movements can still be felt in the arrangement of things that remain. The asteroid belt beyond Mars holds countless fragments, yet most of them stay clustered far from the inner solar system. Jupiter's gravity acts like a distant shepherd, that is shaping the outer boundary of that region and preventing many asteroids from drifting inward. Inside Mars' orbit, Earth and Venus dominate the gravitational landscape, sweeping away debris that strays too close. Between those two zones lies a corridor where motion once may have been calmer, a place where matter could gather quietly, a place where a planet might have grown. And perhaps for a time it did. If such a world existed, it would have circled the Sun gently between its two neighbours, completing its orbit every few Earth years beneath the steady warmth of sunlight. Its gravity would have collected nearby debris, slowly clearing the region around its path. Asteroids drifting too close would have been captured or scattered away. Dust would have settled. The orbital valley would have grown calm. But planets are not permanent. They live long lives compared with mountains or oceans, yet even worlds are temporary shapes within the wider story of the universe. Gravity builds them, gravity reshapes them, and sometimes gravity quietly dismantles them again. If a world once lived in that silent corridor between Earth and Mars, its disappearance would not necessarily leave dramatic evidence behind. Time smooths disturbances. Orbits relax, fragments drift away. Eventually only subtle hints remain in the architecture of space. A slightly wider gap between planets. A distribution of dust that feels gently incomplete. A field of asteroids farther outward, carrying fragments that once belonged to something larger. These are not conclusions, they are questions. The kind the universe leaves behind when it erases its earlier drafts. Yet even erased stories leave echoes. Every meteorite that falls through Earth's sky carries a whisper from those distant ages when planets were still forming. Each fragment offers a glimpse into the chaotic youth of the solar system, when worlds collided and merged and sometimes vanished entirely. Most of those stones come from the asteroid belt. But the belt itself may be a graveyard of attempts, a place where gravity began writing several planetary stories and then abandoned them halfway through. And so the silence between Earth and Mars remains, not empty, but reflective, a quiet valley through which sunlight passes day after day, year after year, billion after billion of years. Dust drifts there still, drifts. There are tiny particles tracing invisible paths around the sun, each grain turning slowly through light and darkness, each one carrying the faint chemical memory of something older, perhaps the memory of a world. Time. Beneath the asteroids. The asteroids do not hurry. Each one moves through space with a patience that belongs only to stone. Their orbits unfold slowly around the sun, repeating the same quiet geometry again and again across billions of years. Some spin lazily as they travel, turning like forgotten thoughts through the endless dark. Others tumble unevenly, their fractured shapes remembering the violence that once broke them apart. Yet even in their brokenness, they are calm. Because stone accepts time. Far beyond Mars, within the wide drifting band known as the asteroid belt, yet these fragments continue their long meditation beneath the sun's distant warmth. Millions of them move there, too widely phased to form a crowd, yet numerous enough to fill the region with quiet motion. Each asteroid is a fossil, not of life, but of formation. They remember the earliest moments of the solar system when dust first gathered into bodies large enough to shape their own interiors. Heat moved through them, metals settled downward, silicates rose upward. Some asteroids preserve that ancient layering, evidence that they once belonged to something larger, something that began organizing itself the way planets do. Cores forming quietly beneath crusts of cooling rock, mantles breathing slow heat toward the surface, but the process did not finish. Gravity interrupted the thought. Collisions scattered the pieces. And what remains today drifts in silence beneath the sun. Among these fragments are bodies large enough to feel almost like worlds. Ceres moves there with quiet dignity, its round shape revealing that its gravity once pulled its materials inward until they settled into a sphere. Beneath its pale surface, hidden layers of ice and rock remain locked together like frozen memory. Long ago, warmth may have moved slowly through its interior. Water perhaps flowed briefly beneath the crust before freezing into stillness. Other asteroids tell harsher stories. Vesta bears the mark of an impact so enormous that it carved a basin nearly the size of the asteroid itself. The collision tore through its crust, exposing deeper layers of rock that once lay hidden beneath ancient lava plains. And fragments blasted away from that wound now wander through the asteroid belt as a scattered family of stones, each one a chipped page from Vesta's long geological diary. Across the belt, similar histories unfold within countless other bodies. Some asteroids are metallic, composed largely of iron and nickel. These may be the exposed cores of protoplanets that lost their outer layers through ancient collisions. Others are rocky mixtures of minerals formed within warm interiors. Still others remain primitive, unchanged since the earliest days when dust first condensed from the solar nebula. Together they form a quiet archive, a library of stone. Within their mineral structures lie clues about the temperature of the young solar system, the chemistry of its earliest dust clouds, and the violent collisions that shape the architecture of the planets. Scientists study these fragments carefully when meteorites bring them to Earth. Each sample becomes a window into a time long before memory. Isotopes within the stone decay slowly across billions of years, acting like tiny clocks that measure the age of the material. From these clocks, researchers have learned that many asteroids formed within the first few million years after the sun ignited, an instant in cosmic terms. During that brief era, the solar system was crowded with forming worlds. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Planetary embryos drifting through intersecting orbits, while gravity sorted the survivors from the broken. Some embryos merged together to form the planets known today. Others collided violently, scattering their remains across space. And some, perhaps one in particular between Earth and Mars, may have existed only briefly before being dismantled by the same gravitational forces that once allowed it to form. The asteroids drifting today may carry pieces of that forgotten chapter. Fragments of crust, fragments of mantle, fragments of metallic core, stone that once belonged to a body large enough to begin becoming a planet. But the evidence remains incomplete. Time has scattered the clues. The solar system rarely preserves its early architecture intact. Collisions rearrange it, gravity reshapes it, dust drifts away, yet the asteroids continue their slow movement beneath the sun, each one carrying a small portion of that lost past. Their surfaces darken over time as cosmic radiation alters the minerals exposed to space. Micrometeorites pepper their crusts like silent rain, carving tiny pits that accumulate across millions of years. But beneath those weathered surfaces, the deeper structure remains, unchanged, waiting. When spacecraft visit these distant bodies, they move carefully through the belt, navigating the quiet gaps between wandering stones. From close range, the asteroids appear ancient and solemn, landscapes of broken rock suspended in the endless black. Craters overlap like the rings of old trees. Ridges twist across the terrain where earlier collisions reshaped the crust. Some surfaces are covered with loose rubble that drifts gently when disturbed, floating for long moments before settling again in the weak gravity. These worlds are small, yet they hold enormous memory. And because beneath every crater and fractured ridge lies material older than any mountain on Earth, stone that formed when the solar system itself was still young enough to remember the warmth of its birth. And within those fragments, perhaps, are the last remaining traces of a world that once circled quietly between Earth and Mars, a world that gravity gathered, a world that time slowly scattered, a world whose memory now drifts through space in millions of silent pieces, each asteroid turning slowly beneath the distant sun, each one carrying a little of the past within its stone. The asteroids drift through time the way embers drift through cooling air, slowly, quietly. Each one carries its own long memory, turning through sunlight and shadow without hurry, without destination beyond the quiet rhythm of orbit. Billions of years have passed since the earliest fragments first scattered across the wide band between Mars and Jupiter. Entire histories have unfolded on Earth during that time, oceans forming, mountains rising and dissolving, life discovering countless shapes before returning again to silence. Yet the asteroids remain almost unchanged. Stone is patient. It does not forget quickly. Within many of these fragments lie minerals that cooled so slowly they required millions of years to arrange themselves into stable patterns. Iron crystals grew quietly inside molten cores. Silicate grains aligned themselves beneath gentle pressure deep within bodies that briefly possessed the gravity of small worlds. Those interiors are gone now, broken apart. But the minerals remember. When a meteorite from the asteroid belt lands upon Earth and is opened carefully in a laboratory, the stone often reveals structures that formed long before the continents existed. Some show signs of melting and separation, evidence that the body they came from once held enough heat for metal to sink toward the center, while lighter rock floated upward. This process, known as differentiation, is how planets organize themselves. It is how Earth formed its iron core, it is how Mars shaped its layered interior, and it is how smaller planetary embryos may have begun forming throughout the early solar system before collisions scattered them apart. The asteroid belt may hold the surviving fragments of many such embryos, worlds that began forming but never finished becoming planets. Some grew large enough for their interiors to warm and reorganize. Others remained cold clusters of dust and stone. Still others may have briefly resembled true planets before being shattered by catastrophic impacts or destabilized by the distant gravity of Jupiter. Each asteroid drifting there today carries a quiet piece of that ancient story. Some fragments are metallic, dense bodies composed mostly of iron and nickel. These may be the exposed cores of protoplanets whose outer layers were stripped away long ago. Others are basaltic rock, material that once cooled from molten lava flowing across the surface of a larger body. Still others remain primitive mixtures of dust and ice, preserved almost exactly as they formed in the early solar nebula. Together they form a scattered archive of planetary attempts, and a library of beginnings. When spacecraft approach these asteroids, the view from close distance reveals landscapes that feel strangely familiar and alien at once. Jagged ridges rise above cratered plains, boulders lie scattered across surfaces shaped by countless ancient impacts. But gravity there is weak. A human walking across such terrain would weigh almost nothing. A gentle step might lift loose stones into slow motion, allowing them to float briefly before settling again across the fractured ground. Silence dominates these worlds. No wind moves the dust, no water smooths the stone. Only sunlight and darkness pass slowly across the surface as the asteroid turns. And yet beneath that stillness lies time, deep time. The atoms inside those rocks were forged in stars that lived and died long before the sun was born. A supernova explosion scattered those atoms across interstellar clouds, where they drifted for millions of years before gravity gathered them again into the swirling disk that formed the solar system. Dust became pebbles, pebbles became stones, stones became worlds, and some of those worlds never survived the long negotiation of gravity that followed. The asteroid belt may be the quiet aftermath of that negotiation. A place where countless attempts at planetary formation were interrupted, where fragments of early worlds remained suspended between success and disappearance. Among them may lie the remains of a planet that once circled between Earth and Mars. If such a world existed, then it may have lived only briefly in the immense scale of cosmic time, perhaps a few tens of millions of years before collisions and gravitational disturbances dismantled it. But even a brief existence would have left traces. Metal that once cooled within its core, lava that once flowed across its surface, minerals that once formed beneath pressure deep inside a growing mantle. Those traces may now wander the asteroid belt as fragments indistinguishable from the rest. Time has mixed them together. Stone does not carry labels, only memory. And memory in the universe is rarely complete. Yet the slow turning of the asteroids continues, orbit after orbit, each one repeating the same long path around the sun, guided by gravity the way drifting seeds follow the quiet patterns of wind. They do not know what they once were. They do not remember the shapes they once formed together. But somewhere within their mineral structures lies the faint echo of a world that may have existed between Earth and Mars. A world that gathered itself slowly from dust. A world that cooled beneath the distant sun. A world that gravity allowed to live for a while. And then, like many early thoughts of the universe, it faded, not entirely, but enough, leaving behind only fragments, turning slowly through space, waiting beneath the patient light of the sun. The world that might have been. Some stories in the universe never finish being written. They remain suspended between possibility and silence, like dust drifting through a beam of light in a quiet room. The missing world between Earth and Mars may be one of those stories. If it existed, if gravity once gathered enough stone there to form a planet, its life would have unfolded slowly beneath the distant sun, long before Earth's oceans breathed their first tides, a young world circling quietly in the middle distance, not too close to the warmth of the inner planets, not too far from the cold outskirts beyond Mars, just a small sphere of cooling rock moving patiently through sunlight. Its days would have been long, its nights endless. Without an atmosphere to soften the sky, the stars would have shone with perfect clarity above its silent plains. The sun would rise slowly over jagged horizons of stone, casting long shadows across fields of dark basalt where ancient lava once flowed. Volcanoes might have risen there, not the towering peaks known on Earth, but broad domes of hardened lava spreading slowly across the surface as heat from the interior found quiet paths toward the sky. Molten rock would emerge slowly through fractures in the crust, flow, cool, and harden again beneath the blackness of space, each eruption leaving behind another layer of stone, another page in the geological memory of the world. Inside the planet, gravity would have been quietly shaping its hidden structure, iron sinking toward the center, silicate rock rising upward. Layer by layer, the interior would have arranged itself into the familiar architecture of planetary bodies: core, mantle, crust. The core, dense and mastlowy, would have held the deepest heat, glowing faintly beneath enormous pressure. Above it, the mantle would move slowly, the currents of warm rock drifting through darkness, like the slow breathing of the planet itself. And at the surface, the crust would cool gradually beneath the distant sun. Craters from ancient impacts would mark the plains, some shallow, some deep enough to expose layers of rock that formed long before the surface hardened. Without air or water to erase those scars, they would remain for millions of years, quietly recording the history of collisions that shaped the early solar system. Perhaps small fragments captured by the planet's gravity would have become temporary moons, wandering stones crossing the sky for a few centuries before drifting away again into solar orbit. Perhaps the world possessed faint traces of water trapped within its minerals, released briefly during volcanic eruptions before freezing instantly into crystalline frost across the cold surface. Or perhaps it remained entirely dry, a desert of stone beneath endless stars. No wind, no oceans, no forests, only silence. But even silence can hold a kind of life. Not biological life, geological life. The slow processes by which worlds shape themselves over immense spans of time. Volcanoes breathing heat, crust cracking under the strain of cooling rock, impacts reshaping the surface as wandering fragments from the young solar system arrive without warning. Each event small compared with the life of the planet itself, yet together they would form the quiet rhythm of a world learning to exist. The planet would circle the sun again and again, thousands of times, millions, and each orbit a repetition of the same gentle path through the dark. Earth would drift nearby in its own orbit closer to the sun. Mars would wander outward beneath colder light. 3 worlds sharing the inner solar system like distant neighbours, perhaps occasionally passing near one another across the vast emptiness between their paths, gravity whispering quietly between them. But the early solar system was never completely calm. Even during the slow cooling of young planets, the architecture of gravity continued shifting beneath the surface of things. Jupiter's enormous mass stirred distant regions with subtle resonances. Asteroids wandered unpredictably through crossing orbits. Fragments from ancient collisions drifted through the inner system like lost thoughts. And over time, those influences would begin touching the orbit of the small world between Earth and Mars. At first gently, barely noticeable, a slight stretching of its path around the Sun, a slight tilt in the plane of its motion. Changes small enough to pass unnoticed across thousands of orbits. But time amplifies whispers. Each gravitational nudge would accumulate slowly across millions of years. The planet's orbit might stretch further. Its encounters with wandering asteroids might become more frequent. Its once quiet path through space might begin crossing regions of growing instability. And somewhere within those quiet shifts, the future of the world would begin changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. The way cliffs slowly lean toward the sea long before the first stone falls, and the way ancient ice begins to crack long before the glacier finally breaks, gravity would continue its endless conversation with the planet's motion. A conversation that began when the solar system was young. A conversation that might one day reshape the orbit of that quiet world. And somewhere within that slow dialogue of forces, the fate of the missing planet may already have been written. But even if the world eventually disappeared, its fragments scattered across the asteroid belt, its orbit erased by time, it would not have vanished completely. Because stone remembers, dust remembers. Every asteroid still circling beyond Mars may carry a fragment of that forgotten story. Each meteorite that falls to Earth may hold a grain of the past within its minerals, a whisper of a world that once circled the Sun, a world that gravity gathered, a world that time slowly unmade, and yet, in the silent valley between Earth and Mars, the sunlight still passes every day. The same path, the same distance, as though something once moved there, and the universe is not entirely forgotten. If that world truly circled the Sun once, its years would have passed quietly, not marked by seasons the way Earth knows them, no winds sweeping across oceans, no rains softening mountains into valleys, only the steady rhythm of orbit. Light, dark, light again. The sun would rise over the stone plains slowly, lifting above the horizon without clouds to soften its glare. Shadows would stretch across cratered terrain, long and precise in the thin geometry of airless space. The surface would warm gently, then cool again when night returned, and each rotation added a soft breath of temperature across ancient rock. Over millions of years, the crust of the planet would continue settling into stillness. Volcanoes that once whispered molten rock across its plains would quiet as interior heat slowly escaped into the cold silence above. The mantle beneath the crust would move more slowly, then slower still. Eventually, even that deep geological breathing would fade. The world would become still, a planet of stone resting beneath an unchanging sky. Yet stillness is never permanent in the solar system. Fragments continue to wander. Even in calm regions of space, small asteroids drift through unseen pathways carved by gravity. Some pass quietly by, others arrive closer, drawn inward by the gentle pull of a planet's mass. Each impact becomes a punctuation mark in the story of a world. And a flash of energy, a crater opening like a wound, then silence again. Over millions of years, thousands of such impacts would accumulate across the surface of the quiet planet. Some craters shallow and wide, others deep enough to expose layers of ancient rock that had cooled during the planet's earliest days. The landscape would become a map of time, each scar a memory of an encounter between stone and stone. Without wind or water to erase them, those craters would remain almost forever. The surface would grow older with every passing orbit, older than deserts, older than mountains, older than oceans. Meanwhile, the orbit of the planet would continue drifting almost imperceptibly beneath the gravitational influence of its neighbours. Earth's gravity would whisper during close passages, Mars would whisper too. But Jupiter's distant voice would remain the deepest, its immense mass resonating across the architecture of the solar system. Those resonances, tiny repeated nudges occurring every few orbits, would slowly reshape the path of the small planet between Earth and Mars. Not enough to break it immediately, but enough to stretch its orbit slightly, a small elongation, a gentle tilt. Over millions of years these changes would accumulate. The once circular orbit would become more oval. The planet would travel closer to the Sun during part of its journey, then drift farther away during another. This stretching of its path would increase its encounters with wandering debris, Asteroids from the growing belt beyond Mars would occasionally cross its orbit. Most would miss, but some would not. Impacts would grow larger, more frequent, and each collision shaking the crust of the planet like distant thunder rolling beneath the stone. Fragments would blast outward into space, joining the slow river of debris drifting through the region. Yet the planet would endure for a time. Planets are stubborn shapes. They resist destruction for as long as gravity can hold them together. But eventually the balance between stability and disturbance would tip. The stretched orbit would carry the planet into regions where Jupiter's resonances were stronger. Gravitational echoes would accumulate faster now, nudging its path further out of alignment. Each orbit would grow more eccentric, each encounter with drifting asteroids more dangerous. Collisions would begin tearing away larger pieces of the crust, mountains shattered, plains fractured, her fragments escaping the weakened gravity of the world. Over immense spans of time, the once whole planet would begin losing mass. First slowly, then more quickly. The debris created by those impacts would spread across nearby space, forming a loose halo of stone drifting along similar orbits around the Sun. Eventually, the structure of the planet itself would weaken, fractures running deep into its interior. The core no longer held as firmly by the diminishing mass of the outer layers. When the next large collision arrived, and in the early solar system, such collisions were inevitable. The damage would be deeper than before. Stone cracking apart along ancient faults, whole regions of the crust collapsing, fragments launched into space by the force of impact, gravity struggling to gather them again. But each fragment escaping made the world smaller, weaker, more fragile. The planet would not vanish in a single explosion. Instead, it would unravel. Stone turning into pieces, pieces turning into clouds of debris drifting along the same orbit the planet once followed. Over millions of years, those fragments would spread outward into a wide band of asteroids between Mars and Jupiter. Some pieces large enough to become the asteroids still seen today, others small enough to grind slowly into dust through countless tiny collisions. The world would fade, not entirely, but enough that the solar system would eventually move on without it. Earth would continue its quiet orbit closer to the Sun, Mars would wander beneath colder light beyond, and between them, the valley where the planet once moved would grow silent again. And only fragments would remain, drifting through sunlight, turning slowly through darkness, waiting. And billions of years later, when a meteorite falls through Earth's sky as a brief streak of light, it may carry within it a grain of that vanished world, a tiny fossil of a planet that once existed, a whisper of a story the solar system almost finished writing, but did not, because the universe often begins things it never fully completes. Dust gathers into worlds, worlds dissolve into dust, and somewhere between Earth and Mars, the sunlight still passes through the quiet space where a planet might once have circled. The same path. The same distance. As though gravity remembers, even when time forgets.